Some brands offer you low finance, or cashback, or servicing.
Renault don't do ors. We do ands. The Renault Kadjar with 1.91% APR and €1,000 cashback and 3 years servicing, saving you thousands. Renault, the brand with the ands. Visit your local Renault dealer. Finance is made under a hire purchase agreement. Terms and conditions apply. Deposit required. Subject to lending criteria. See Renault.ie.
Blog Talk Radio.
No risk it, no biscuit.
Coming from the Arizona desert, presented by SBNation.com. For Arizona Cardinals fans, by Arizona Cardinals fans, with outsider and insider's perspective, this is Revenge of the Birds. Good evening, Arizona Cardinals fans. This is your host, Jess for Revenge of the Birds Radio. I apologize, I didn't get connected real quickly. Actually had a cord disconnected. So we are here on a Thursday night as we are a couple of days away from the Arizona Cardinals facing the Detroit Lions in their home opener on Sunday at University of Phoenix Stadium. And before we get started talking about that, actually a couple of things happened today. One, the game was announced as a sellout. That's really no surprise. There's been a sellout every single game in University of Phoenix Stadium and since it opened. And secondly, we have a bit of news regarding the Arizona Cardinals, and that is the announcement that the team has agreed to terms with a one-year contract extension with right guard Paul Faneca, who kind of was an afterthought in signing during the offseason, brought in. And then after basically working his entire career as a journeyman at tackle, he was moved inside and made a big impression in camp. Did really well when moving inside, as Bruce Arians called it, working inside the phone booth. And when during college went down with his leg fracture during the preseason, Faneca stepped in, played very well, and, well, was set to be a good depth guy. And it turned out that his play became very important as Jonathan Cooper went down for the season with a broken leg. They moved Darren College back over to left guard, and Faneca steps right in at right guard. And now, after playing a whopping one game of the regular season, Faneca now has himself a contract extension, got himself a little bit of security, and yeah, you could read this more than one way. You can tell, or you could look at it this way. Well, they took care of their right guard position for next year, as Jonathan Cooper is expected to be back and should be back next year to play again at left guard, and that will allow the team to save a heck of a lot of money with Darren College and his contract number. He's due to make several million next year. I think that I have to pull up the exact numbers, but it looked as if it was, I think it's like $6.75 million. And, well, with that, it saves them money if there's anything else going with that. No, at minimum, they've got their next year's depth taken care of, a guy they know they can step in who may. I put it on RevengeOfTheBirds.com this afternoon with the announcement of the extension. At minimum, it gives them someone depth for next year. If he turns into a starter, then I'm sure it's a steal. And it provides a little bit of competition. He's going to be around again next year. And then we've got Earl Watford, who they signed. Darren College do? Let me see. Salaries by year. I'm pulling this up on SpotTrack.com, and it's looking like. Give me a second. But anyhow, they drafted Earl Watford. They drafted Jonathan Cooper. You had to figure that they were in the mix to be the guard positions for the next few years. Of course, there's talk that Watford, of course, could be moved to center. He is due. I guess I got this pulled up that for this next year, he is due, Darren College that is, $7.275 million. So that's $7.3 million there is a starting guard. That's a big number. I'm sure that Fanika's number is probably in the range of less than $1 million, perhaps with some incentives that will lead to getting up to in the $1 million range. I don't know. We'll find out more about those contracts as it hits as the Players Association reveals that information. Now, so we got Fanica for next year. That could mean goodbye College, or if anything else, to see if Fanica could compete with him and take his position. Watford probably is still another year away after that. So at minimum, you've got a solid depth guy, and depending how he plays, maybe he's a starter. But yeah, so we've got Paul Fanica. Of all the players you could have had signing a contract extension at the start of this year to perhaps get some salary cap relief this year, maybe next. Paul Fanica probably wouldn't be the first one that came to mind. You know they're going to want to extend Patrick Peterson. You know they might, if they want to keep Darren College around, likely they're going to want to make that cap number a bit more manageable. They might look at some of the other players as well. Darnell Dockett, Levi Brown was another one. Darnell Dockett is due to make $8.8 million next year. Calais, no, he's good. Levi Brown is due to make another $7.7 million next year. And so, yeah, it's going to be an interesting bit of information. But mainly what we're here to talk, I'm here tonight to talk about the Arizona Cardinals coming up against the Detroit Lions. And if you can remember last season, the Detroit Lions came to town in the middle of the Arizona Cardinals losing streak. And I believe it was at 9 games. And the Lions were coming in a bit in a funk themselves, but looked at the Arizona Cardinals as a team that they should beat. And that game turned out to be quite the laugher. Here's some of the numbers. Final score, of course, it was 38. Arizona Cardinals, 38 points. If you recall, the offense the Cardinals had last season was ridiculous. And so 38 points to 10. And that happened to be the one game that Beanie Wells did anything. He had 3 rushing touchdowns on the game. Carried the ball 17 times for 67 yards. Ryan Lindley was inefficient, 14 of 21 for a whopping 104 yards. He didn't throw any touchdowns because we know that Ryan Lindley didn't throw any touchdowns last year. He was picked off once, but the story was really the defense. As well, Calvin Johnson had a pretty good numbers. It was kind of the quiet big numbers. He had 10 catches for 121 yards, but he didn't score a touchdown. This pass defense made Matthew Stafford look ridiculous. He threw for 246 yards and 3 picks. 2 of them were returned for touchdowns, so they got 3 rushing touchdowns from Beanie Wells. They got 2 defensive touchdowns off of those pick sixes. And the Lions season basically imploded that. And that was the last bright spot we saw from the Cardinals last season. That was their last win, the only one that they had after their 4-0 start. And we get the Lions again this year, who come into town after a 34-24 win over the Minnesota Vikings. Kind of looked good in kind of all phases, put up 34 points. And they held Adrian Peterson, that is, Mr. AD, Mr. All Everything, a robot of sorts. He, in his very first touch from scrimmage, scampered in 78 yards for a touchdown, but then after that, I think, came out to like 18 yards on his next 15 carries, something like that. really quite a good performance. And, of course, there was also the Ndamukong Suh incident on that they had a defensive touchdown called back because of a completely unnecessary, just a useless, illegal low block that he threw at the Vikings center. It had earned him a $100,000 fine that he is currently appealing. That Friday morning we'll have a conference call with the NFL to appeal that. There was some talk perhaps that he would be suspended, being a repeat offender for those illegal hits, unnecessary roughes, personal fouls, that he might be out for the game against the Cardinals. That will not be the case. But if we revisit, so we've got a team in the Lions that really look kind of good, and they have the new addition. They got Reggie Bush in their backfield. The Arizona Cardinals, coming off their first week loss, where they looked like they had everything controlled with the 11-point lead heading into the fourth quarter, gave up a long touchdown drive early. It was kind of towards the end of the third, beginning of the fourth. Allowed them to score the game-tying field goal, and then after the offense, it kind of all fell apart in the fourth quarter. The offense couldn't move the ball, couldn't put themselves in a position to score any points. The defense couldn't hold. I mean, the defense had a good game, and they had the created turnovers. They saved a touchdown off a turnover. They scored a defensive touchdown with a tipped pass that Shaughnessy got his mitts on, that Dan Williams scooped out of the air and scored a touchdown. And things looked good. They had an 11-point lead, and then things kind of fell apart. I said it on the air on Tuesday that it was eerily reminiscent of the early part of 2011 when Ray Horton was new in town, and so they had the defensive schemes, and they got burnt a lot down the field because of missed assignments. And then the offense wasn't quite clicking. They had Kevin Cobb underneath center after the lockout, and he was not real proficient in the offense, and was in his scampery, skittery mode where he would run away from pressure that wasn't necessarily there. But their offense moved the ball. Early in the season, the offense would move the ball some. You think, hey, we can do this. And then there'd be a lead. Washington game is a perfect example. When they had the lead, then couldn't run the 4-minute drill, couldn't stop the clock. Then the defense gave up the points. And then when the offense had a chance, there was a turnover. Happened again against the Giants, 10-point lead in the fourth quarter, and it evaporated. And the offense wasn't able to – defense didn't stop. The Giants won, and offensively they weren't able to run any clock off. And there was some question of play calling. But the game against St. Louis I really felt was something rather reminiscent of 2011, which gives me a little bit of hope for what could happen in the season, simply because of the fact that they turned it around. They ended up 8-8 that year. We have a better quarterback in Carson Palmer than Kevin Cobb was. The defense is going to be a question mark. Is Todd Bowles' system going to come around the way Ray Horton's did? That remains to be seen. But the Lions come to town looking to make some noise and perhaps avenge that loss. And we actually have a guest on our show tonight, visiting us through Pride of Detroit, our SB Nation Detroit Lions blog. And again, this is Revenge of the Birds Radio. You're listening to our Arizona Cardinals radio show and podcast as we get ready for the game against the Detroit Lions. And I've got Sean on the line, and I'm really excited to have him. So we'll go ahead and bring him on the line. We're going to talk a little bit about what the Lions bring with the offseason. They got Reggie Bush. Of course, we know about Ndamukong Suh and Nick Fairley. They got Matthew Stafford, Calvin Johnson. They really have some skilled players. So let's bring Sean on and give a great welcome to Sean Yuille from Pride of Detroit. And let's get him on the phone. And we're glad to have you today, Sean. How are you doing tonight?
I'm good. How about you?
I'm doing great. I really appreciate you coming on to talk with us here at Revenge of the Birds Radio. And well, let's first start things off. The off season. What happened in the off season for the Lions? I know kind of the big signing, I would suppose, would be Reggie Bush, and the Cardinals Cardinals actually pursued him a bit. He was one of the targets that they had early on in free agency. But tell us a little bit about how the Lions off season went for you guys. What was good? What was disappointing? And what has you most excited for this season that's now started?
Well, you can really divide the Lions off season into a few main parts, and the first part revolved around making a few coaching changes here or there. They decided not to fire Jim Schwartz, which it wasn't really a huge shock considering he did just get an extension before the 2012 season. And they also decided to retain both coordinators on offense and defense. And so most of the changes were minor, all things considered, but that was the first part of the offseason for the team. And then they started to transition into the draft process by coaching the Senior Bowl. And they got to look at a lot of guys that they ended up taking later on. Ziggy Ansah, Larry Warford, Michael Williams, a tight end. All those guys played for them in the Senior Bowl, and they ended up drafting them in April. And then going into free agency, Reggie Bush was definitely the biggest name. And he was connected to the Lions just from pure speculation going back to February, just because the Lions needed a running back that was in the Javid Best mold, where he was somebody who could be a playmaker out of the backfield, takes the attention away from Calvin Johnson. And so the expectation was that the Lions would pursue Bush once it came out that he probably was not going to end up re-signing with Miami. And once free agency opened, lo and behold, the Lions pursued Bush, and Bush ended up visiting Detroit first and foremost, and he didn't end up leaving without a deal. So he signed as soon as he visited there. And really the main selling point was the fact that he'll have a lot of room to work with because of Calvin Johnson. Defenses did not load up the box too often against the Lions last season. And we saw that this past week where Bush had a lot of room to operate, and he made defenses pay both as a running back and as a receiver. And that's a real exciting thing going forward because the Lions really lacked that home run threat last year.
Well,
Javid Best couldn't get cleared from that concussion. And so now the hope is that if Bush can stay healthy all season long, it'll be a big shift for the Lions offense, which really was able to put up yards but not very efficiently last year.
Well, if you kind of look at it, because Javid Best, the best way I can, he was a really good fit for what you guys like to do offensively. You guys like to throw the ball around the field. You've got the receivers. It's kind of maybe not I wouldn't quite compare it to the run and shoot days of the early 90s, but kind of the same ilk where they like throwing the ball around. And he had that skill set where not only could he make plays as a runner, but as a receiver. And then you could pick up a guy like Reggie Bush, who I would think you would imagine is the perfect fit for the team, and perhaps that the Lions offense is probably the perfect fit for him as a player and for his skill set. Would you say that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And that's what drew Bush to Detroit in the first place, the fact that he would be in an offense that would give him space to operate with and that would use him in a way where it would go with his skill set. And I know Miami tried to turn him into an every down back, and he actually did perform quite well in that role. And this role is more like what he experienced in his New Orleans days, where he's not going to necessarily be relied upon every down to run the ball, but he is somebody who could get a touch on the ball every down. And we saw that with Javid Best. And it's funny, if you go back to 2011, before Javid Best got hurt, the Lions were 5-0. And after that point, when Best left the offense because of that concussion and never returned, the Lions dealt with a really rough patch in the middle of that season. And they did rebound later on to make the playoffs for the first time in more than a decade. But we saw last year how big of an issue it was without that kind of a player in the offense. And General Manager Martin Mayhew said after the season his biggest mistake was not having somebody as a backup plan for Best because they were counting on him being cleared. And probably if this were 3 or 4 years ago, he would have been cleared to play just because there wasn't such a big emphasis on concussions. But he wasn't, and now Best is out, so Bush is in, and the Lions offense is rolling once again.
And now, do you expect now with the addition of Bush, granted his skill set, of course, you can add him to the passing game. Matthew Stafford leading the league the past couple of years in throw passing attempts. Do you still expect to see that, or do you think that will be peeled back a little bit now that you have a guy who can carry the ball 20 times a game?
I think the hope when they did add Bush was that they would become a little bit more balanced. And, I mean, just becoming a little bit more balanced isn't saying a whole lot for the pass-run ratio because the Lions did throw it so much last year. And Stafford set a record by throwing it, I think, 727 times. Just a ridiculous number. And that's part of the reason why he struggled so much. The Lions put way too much on his shoulders, and really they made him try to do way too much in the passing game, especially without some of his key receivers who went down with injuries, without that running back weapon, and with struggles at the tight end position. It was just not pretty for the most part. But this year with Bush, I think you're going to see something where the Lions have the ability to run it more often. And that also goes along with the changes they've made on their offensive line. 3 new starters this year, including Riley Reif at left tackle and Larry Warford at right guard. And then you have Jason Fox at right tackle, although he just got hurt last week. So Corey Hilliard is currently slated to start this week if Fox can't go. But they were really a lot more holes than usual last week against the Minnesota Vikings. And the Lions' running game has usually been a situation where you give it off to the running back. Maybe there's a hole, but usually not, and he just runs into the pile, and that's that. But Bush, between his ability to create and between the Lions' new offensive line's ability to open up some holes, I think it's a situation where you'll have more running this season. And at the end of the day, that's a much better thing for the Lions' offense because you can't put it all on Stafford as we saw last year just because the offense doesn't run very efficiently when you're doing nothing but passing.
Now, how much concern was there for Stafford's play after what happened? I mean, the drop-off is substantial. You go for his touchdowns are less than half it was in 2011. Now, granted, he had a monster year in 2011, the 41 touchdown pass over 5,000 yards passing. But he goes down to 20 in 2012. His interceptions go up a tick from 16 to 17. And his passing completion, he drops just a little bit below 60%, and he almost eclipses the 5,000 mark. Was there much concern about how much was there worried about maybe the 2011 season was the exception rather than the norm? Was there much talk of that in Detroit?
Oh, yeah. That was really the story of the preseason because coming out of 2012, there was a lot of concern about Stafford's mechanics and how he reverts to the sidearm too often and how he makes too many passes that are forced, and that's why he ends up throwing some very untimely interceptions. And that sort of carried over to the preseason this year because he was just not very good. I mean, the first-team offense in general is not good, and the fact that Calvin Johnson pretty much took the entire preseason off to heal a knee injury didn't help. But there was a lot of concern surrounding whether Stafford is taking another step back and he just hasn't been able to rebound, especially coming off of that monster contract extension he just got earlier in the summer. And, I mean, there were questions certainly about is he truly going to be the answer for the Lions at quarterback going forward. And I think the important thing to remember from 2012 is that there were a lot of circumstances working against Stafford. And there was a crazy stat where Calvin Johnson was tackled inside the 5-yard line 5 or 6 times, and Lions receivers in general were tackled inside the 5, I think, over 20 times. And
oh, goodness.
So if you take that bad luck out, I mean, he could easily have ended up with 30 touchdowns or more. And then you also had the injury aspect where Nate Burleson went down, I think, in week 7 with a broken leg, and he missed the rest of the year. Ryan Broyles, just as he was really becoming one of Stafford's go-to guys, tore another ACL, and he missed the rest of the year. And then you had the whole Titus Young fiasco where he was expected to be the Lions' number 2 receiver and step up and become a breakout player. And instead, he just completely loses his mind and ends up off the team by the end of the year. And so the Lions really had a tough situation in terms of who Stafford was throwing to. I mean, by the end of the year, it was a guy off the practice squad, a guy that they traded for midseason, and Calvin Johnson. And so Calvin obviously put up big numbers considering he set a record for receiving yards, but Stafford didn't have a whole lot else to work with.
Now, I asked you this a bit off the air, but be interesting. Last year, the Cardinals started off with the 4-0 season. Then they go and lose a gazillion games in a row, and their one win late in the year was not just a squeaker, but it was quite handily. It was against the Lions at home, and now they return to Glendale where it happened. And I'm looking back over the stat sheet. Your defense didn't do horribly. Granted, the Cardinals' offense was awful, but that was the one game when actually Beanie Wells made any sort of contribution at all. Matt Stafford had 3 interceptions, 2 that were returned for touchdowns. What happened? What you told me a little about the air, but what is it that happened exactly in that game?
Well, yeah, going into that game, the Lions were in the midst of a losing streak, and they ended up finishing the year with 8 straight losses. And the thinking all along, like, that game was circled on the schedule as, okay, they'll finally get past this bad luck they've had at the end of games. I know coming in they had lost like 3 or 4 straight games where they had the lead in the fourth quarter or something along the lines of that. And they were competitive in all of their losses, surprisingly. And that's what ended up pushing the Lions' point differential a lot higher than it probably should have been for a 4-12 team. But yeah, going into that Cardinals game, everybody thought it would be the game that ends the streak, and instead the wheels just completely fell off the wagon. And pretty much everything that had gone wrong leading up to that game, we saw even more, and it was just magnified in that one game. And I think it was just the point where everybody sort of just gave up. And we all saw it coming at some point in the season. And at the Arizona Cardinals, I didn't necessarily expect it to be that game, but the one game that you thought they might win, you have some bad pick sixes, you just can't get the game going at all, and you end up losing to a team that you thought was inferior, and it turns out they just completely smack you in the face. And so that was the game where it was the tipping point of all the bad luck, all the bad issues they've had throughout the season. And, I mean, that's the point where people were asking, did Jim Schwartz just lose his team altogether? And, I mean, he was able to stave off all that criticism enough to keep his job. But going back to that season, if he doesn't succeed this year, that'll be a point where you really look at it and ask, what the heck happened?
Looking forward to the game on Sunday, where do you think that are going to be the Lions' trouble matchups? And we'll start. Where do you think where do the Cardinals match up favorably in their favor against Detroit?
Well, I think we saw last year Patrick Peterson did a really nice job against Calvin Johnson. And Calvin didn't do a whole lot in week 1 against the Vikings, but the Lions were able to get everybody else involved. Reggie Bush did a whole lot on the ground and through the air. Joique Bell, the same situation, the other running back that the Lions have really made a big part of the offense. And then you even had some unknown players like Patrick Edwards, a rookie wide receiver, Joseph Fourier, and a drafted tight end stepping up and making plays. And if the Lions can't get those other guys going, then they're going to be in some trouble because they can't necessarily rely on Calvin Johnson to produce 200 yards and 2 touchdowns against a guy like Patrick Peterson. And so I think that's where if they struggle in the passing game, they might feel a need to force things, and that's where they get into a lot of trouble.
We were actually viewing on our show with my other staff members on Tuesday, and they predict a shootout type, not just like a 20 to 28.31, but probably to 30 and 40 points on both teams, with one of them perhaps outlasting the other or him having that painful. Because both Stafford and Carson Palmer both have reputations of having untimely interceptions. So it could be the war of attrition there. But do you see that happening this time around? Another kind of a shootout where either one team really goes off, or that we're going to see something both ways up and down the field?
I could certainly see that. And in the first half, if not for the Lions just ridiculous mistakes like the Sue penalty where you take off a pick 6, or there were 3 touchdowns that were overturned upon further review. I mean, things like that. The Minnesota game really was developing into a shootout. And in the second half, that completely changed because the Vikings just could not get anything going offensively. Even with Adrian Peterson, he opened the game with a 78-yard touchdown, and then he gained like 18 yards in the next 15 carries. But definitely this week, I think the Cardinals offense, with the addition of Palmer, has the ability to put up yards, especially through the air. And rookie Darius Slay, a cornerback out of Mississippi State, is a starter for the Lions, and he got benched last week after giving up some big receptions. And so if he doesn't play well and he gets picked on, it could be some big-time yardage there. And then the Lions always have the ability to go off. It just depends on how much they decide to shoot themselves in the foot. But, yeah, this definitely has the makings of a possible shootout. And I don't think it would be just one team going off. I don't think it'll be a blowout either way. I just don't think the Lions are built to either be on the losing or winning side of a blowout at this point. But I definitely think we could see some points put up on the board on Sunday.
Now, the reputation of your defense is where their money is made up front with Fairley and with Ndamukong Suh. Now, I saw Fairley was on it. How concerning is the injury to Fairley, or is that one of those small injuries that he'll likely play through on Sunday?
Yeah, I think it's just more precautionary that he was out on Wednesday. He injured his shoulder late in the Vikings game, and he was able to finish it, unlike a couple other guys who were out on Wednesday. So it's probably just give him some rest. Probably won't even bother practicing, and maybe limited on Friday, but he'll probably suit up on Sunday.
Okay, so you guys have the reputation of great inside presence. One of my guys on staff, Seth Cox, he actually made a point to say what is kind of underrated is the guys you have off the edge. Tell us a little bit about Michael Young and how Ziggy Ansah is looking so far. Our concern for the Cardinals, obviously, right now is the play at tackle. Levi Brown got beat by Robert Quinn 3 times for sacks and a couple of forced fumbles, penalties, other hurries. And Eric Winston was better, but he didn't look incredibly good in pass protection as well. Those guys on the edge, how good can they be, and are they looking their chops at the offensive line position if they see Levi Brown? Ooh, we're going to get to Carson.
Yeah, I think they are definitely looking forward to this matchup. And going into the offseason, the Lions had Kyle Vanden Bosch get released, and they had Cliff Averlee for another team, the Seahawks, in free agency. And they pretty much made the decision that this is the time to revamp the defensive ends. And so they went out and signed Jason Jones, who can play inside and outside, and they added Ziggy Ansah in the draft, and they later added Israel Adonijah, who was with the Bears. And they also drafted Devin Taylor, who was inactive last week, as the 5th defensive end. And they also retained Willie Young, who has had the makings of this great breakout player in the preseason, and he hasn't been able to deliver on it once the regular season arrives. But last week he finally showed that he can play in the regular season on the same level, and he turned up one of his best performances. And the common theme with all of these guys is they're at least 6'5", and they're very long. And so they've really created some problems for opposing offensive tackles in the preseason. And they didn't necessarily put a whole lot of pressure on Christian Ponder last week. A lot of that came from Ndamukong Suh and Nick Fairley. But between those two guys in the inside, with the offensive line having to worry about them so much, I think it just automatically creates matchups that favor the defensive ends. And already we've seen some potential from Ziggy Ansah, Willie Young, and the interesting thing is they all pretty much got the same amount of snaps, those 4 defensive ends. So at this point, the Lions are really going 4 deep at the defensive end position with a very even rotation, and that freshness at the end of games could really come in handy, where they're just rolling out guys left and right who haven't played necessarily that much, and they're not being out there on every down.
How much of an issue still is the defensive backfield? Obviously, you had the rookie who got set down during the game in Week 1. Is that still the bugaboo, the Achilles heel of the Detroit defense?
Yeah, that's definitely the weak spot. And Chris Houston is a pretty good number 1 cornerback for the Lions, and he's been around for a few years now. But there's been a revolving door at the other side. And Darius Slade was drafted, and he quickly took over the starting position in the preseason. And at the end of the game, the Lions did bench him, and Jim Schwartz said he made a call to the bullpen of sorts by going to the veteran who was added in training camp, Rasheed Mathis. And he performed quite well in relief of Slay. And so it wasn't as much of a concern late. And it's sort of just a growing pains type thing with Slay, where he's going to make mistakes. He's only a rookie. Cornerbacks typically take some time to develop. But the good thing about the Lions secondary this year, with a somewhat healthy Louis Delmas, it's always an issue with his health, but they've done a good job of managing it so far with his knee issues. And he played every single snap in Week 1, which is just shocking for Lions fans. And then they also added Glover Quinn from the Houston Texans in the offseason, and he has really been a huge addition to the defense. And then you also add in a healthy Bill Bentley, who is in his 2nd year. He's the nickelback. They've got some solid depth. It's just a matter of bringing it all together and getting these guys all on the same page.
Great. So a little bit of prediction. I'm not going to say predict the score, but here we go this way. Vegas they opened with at an even line, and the line has shifted just a little bit to Lions at a 1-point advantage. Not necessarily even. Who would you put your money on? Do you see this as a sneaking away a win on a road team on the road, or do you see this as probably going to be one of your road challenges, despite the fact that the Cardinals, based on all year ago, were not so very good.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting game just because you have that whole past matchup where the Lions expected to win going in. They even expected to win big. And it's sort of the same thing. I get the feeling that Lions fans are expecting a victory just based on what they saw last week. If not for some bad luck and bad mistakes, they easily could have beaten the Vikings by 3 or 4 touchdowns. So I personally don't think it'll be quite that much or anything. But I do expect the Lions to win this week, maybe by 3 to 6 points or something along the lines of that. But I do see a 2-0 start in their future just because they've really started to improve in week 1, and the talent, to me, on paper anyways, just seems to go in their direction.
Great. We have a prediction from our Lions guy that the Lions will be 2-0. My prediction, it would be the opposite of that, but then again, I'm a Cardinals fan, so and I'm used to being disappointed. I really appreciate you having you on tonight, Sean. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and best of luck to you and your team this weekend.
Thanks. Best of luck to you, too.
You have a good night.
So that was a great interview I had there with Sean. Interesting. You definitely get the feeling that Lions fans expected to be much better than what they were last year, and kind of look at the Cardinals again as nothing more, if anything, just a little speed bump in the way of what they're going to do. What should we look forward to this Sunday? Well, matchups that are going to be tough. Reggie Bush is going to be a tough matchup. In fact, Reggie Bush playing the role that he's playing now, think back to New Orleans. The last time the Cardinals saw Reggie Bush was, I don't remember if Reggie Bush ran all over, ran through them, ran around them, ran everywhere in that playoff game, in the fateful end to Kurt Warner's career. He looked great. It was kind of like turning the corner where people said if he learns to do that, like take on defensive players, then he would turn into just amazing. Back then, he's been a successful player. But as we saw last week with Jared Cook, someone with speed, someone with size, covering Bush out of the backfield might have some of the same issues as what the Rams against the Rams. And that could prove to be faithful. Again, now, Calvin Johnson, we know, is going to be a tough matchup. Patrick Peterson wants to line up against him play after play after play. Bruce Arians says it's probably not going to happen. In fact, it didn't happen last year. It wasn't a simple one-on-one situation the entire game. He had help. They shadowed him. He didn't line up man-on-man all the entire time. Now, one thing you'll notice last year, he did, if you look at the stat sheet, said he definitely got the better of Patrick Peterson, catching the ball 10 times for 121 yards. He didn't score a touchdown, though. Patrick got his hands on a couple. Patrick picked off a pass that, if I pull that up, I can recall. He picked off a pass that game. Incorrect. That would be the Greg Toller interception. He returned out of the end zone, 102 yards. And Patrick Peterson did get one. So it was Greg Toller, it was Rashad Johnson, it was Patrick Peterson. Big win. Can we expect the Cardinals defense to do to Sam Bradford, to Matthew Stafford what they did last year? I don't think we can. And so we're going to have to get better offensive production. But luckily, this really sets on Tuesday has really the makings to be one of those huge shootouts. The Detroit defense down the field is not strong, and Carson Palmer has the ability to carve up a defense if he's making good decisions. Matthew Stafford, I don't know if we've seen something. The Cardinals defense has given up some yardage. We could see a lot of moving the ball down the field, and it'll probably come down to a fourth quarter decision by one of the quarterbacks. Who will flinch first? Who will be the first to get that brain fart? It's kind of what I expect to see on Sunday. Defensively, they're going to match up pretty well. I mean, they've got pretty good. The Cardinals are in good. I mean, they have these. We have to see this game. On the offensive side of the ball, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the offensive line. Sean mentioned Ziggy Ansah, Will Young, Seth on Tuesday also talked about Will Young as he could pose problems for Levi Brown. If he's serviceable, if Levi's serviceable, what's actually going to be key is not the rush off the edge. Where Carson Palmer has struggled in his career is that inside pressure. If they get inside pressure, he's not going to be able to step into his throw. He's going to see the pressure coming at him instead of stepping up into the pocket to avoid it and making a throw down the field. If Ndamukong Suh and Nick Fairley, who if he plays, get into the field, so how do Darren Collins, how does he fail? How do they line up? How do they match up? How do they hold up with the pressure? How does Lyle Sunline hold up? What about Paul Faneca, the new guy with the new contract extension? How does he hold up? I don't think it'll be as much of an issue as of the tackles tonight on Sunday. That'll be more the inside pressure. And on offense, what the Cardinals will have to do, they'll have to do a little bit of, there's something just a little bit running the ball. What the Cardinals need to be able to do is run play action. They didn't get to play they didn't get to unload their gun completely. They left 3 bullets in their gun, is what Arians said. 3 plays they didn't take shots down the field. And that's going to be that play action. They need to show the run enough so that they can get those players to bite in this defensive secondary. That way can take the top off the defense. Send Andre Roberts out there. Send Michael Floyd out there. Hit Larry Fitzgerald if he plays. He's been on the injury report this way with the hamstring. He says it's okay. But Arizona Cardinals fans, we're coming to the close of the show, and what do you expect? What do you expect to see from the Detroit Lions? Are you worried about Reggie Bush? Are you worried about Calvin Johnson? Are you worried about that memory being so recent for the Lions that they go off? Predictions on my part, I do expect the Cardinals to bounce back. They play well at home. They have traditionally at University of Phoenix. They've played very well at home. I don't think that the Lions are going to come away with a victory, though I think it will be a shootout. And I told you, if there's one thing I think is going to happen, crazy predictions, I think Patrick Peterson's going to score a touchdown. And I think it might be on the offensive side. He's going to be moving the ball, chucking the ball up and down the field, and he's going to make a play out down the field, and we're going to see him score an offensive touchdown. So fantasy players, if you got Patrick Peterson as on your IDP league, start him. Well, if you would start him anyway, but that'd be a really big bonus to get him on the offensive side. I think that's going to happen this time. He's going to make a big play. The Cardinals fans, we're going to close up shop till next week. Let's keep the discussion going on RevengeOfTheBirds.com. If you're already a reader, you'll know where to find us. If you are not a reader yet, go to RevengeOfTheBirds.com. It's the best place for Arizona Cardinals news. Go to SBNation.com/NFL. We've got a great network of sites. We'll talk about it, but give your predictions. Tell us what you think. And we're going to sign off tonight. Arizona Cardinals fans, next time we talk, hopefully we're 1-1. We don't want an 0-2 start. Have a good night, and I will talk to you with the rest of the podcast crew, with Ben and with Seth. We'll be back on Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Arizona time, midnight Eastern. And then we will hopefully as well be back on the air on Thursday with somebody, with a guest for the next game after that. Have a good night. Great talking to you. Go Cardinals.
No risk it, no biscuit.
Sorry.
You've been listening to Revenge of the Birds. Keep the conversation going by visiting RevengeOfTheBirds.com. Follow us on Twitter at Revenge of Birds. You can also find us on iTunes at Facebook.com/RevengeOfTheBirds.